Hey, you out there in the dating world, ever run into this? You're seeing someone great, things are going really well. But then, you know, when things start to feel a little more obligated.
Oh yeah. It's interesting. It's it's not just your classic commitment issue. We're talking more like an aversion to, I don't know, planning things, making
Mhm.
decisions, even just defining the relationship, that kind of thing.
Right. And it's like, they're awesome until you try to, make weekend plans more than like a couple days in advance, or when you bring up like making things official online, poof, they're gone.
And you know what's so interesting? There's actually a few sides to this whole thing. Some people, they're just naturally more independent. Think
Yeah.
of it like someone who loves to go solo camping. They enjoy
Mhm.
connecting, but they need a lot of space. Psychology,
Mhm.
Sometimes that's called avoidant attachment. But we don't have to get all technical with the labels.
That makes sense. But I'm thinking there are also people who just like genuinely enjoy keeping things light and breezy. It's not always some deep psychological thing, right?
Exactly. For some people, that easygoing approach is just their preference,
Yeah.
And the thing is, for some couples, it totally works. One of our listeners even wrote in and said, we're both casual about commitments, and it works for us. It's all about finding the right match.
Okay, so the initial attraction, the less pressure, the
Yeah.
spontaneity, that all checks out. But here's what I'm wondering. What about when one person in the relationship starts to want a little more stability, a little more connection?
That's when it gets a little complicated.
Mm.
Because even if someone's not trying to hurt their partner, that hesitation to really engage,
Yeah.
it can really start to erode trust,
Yep.
that sense of security,
Yeah.
emotional security.
It's so true. We might think a commitment-free zone sounds fun and freeing, but we all crave connection.
Right. And knowing someone's there for you, not just physically, but
Yeah.
emotionally too. It's huge.
That's it. We want to feel like we can depend on the other person.
Yeah. And that things are going to be at least somewhat predictable. And that's where things can get.
Well, messy if you've got one person happy floating along and the other is wanting more. It's a recipe for heartbreak.
We even heard from a listener who went through this. They told us, I dated someone who was afraid of commitment. At first it was fun, but I quickly realized I wanted more. It was frustrating.
Oof, that's tough. It really highlights how important it is to be on the same page, when it comes to expectations, goals, all of that.
Absolutely. And that brings us to, well, really the foundation of navigating these kinds of situations. Whether you're the one who's seeking more or the one who likes to keep things more open-ended.
I bet you're going to say communication.
You got it. Honest, clear communication.
Yeah.
And communication that considers what both people need.
I can hear our listeners thinking easier said than done. These can be hard conversations to have. How do you even approach them without things getting awkward or, turning into a huge fight?
Here's where setting boundaries can be really powerful. In any relationship, really. But especially with this kind of dynamic.
Yeah.
And the thing is, boundaries aren't just about what you won't tolerate. They're also about making a plan so that your relationship actually works for both people.
Okay, so I'm hearing you say, even if you're not talking marriage and moving in, you can still set up clear agreements.
Absolutely. Like how often you communicate, how you handle disagreements,
Yeah.
even things like how you make decisions as a couple. You can even talk about boundaries around exclusivity, if that's something that's important to you or to both of you.
I love that because it means even if one person's more go with the flow, there can still be a feeling of structure, a feeling of safety, which is often what the other person's looking for.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance where each
Yeah.
person gets to be themselves. But you also have that feeling of support.
This is so helpful. But let's make this even more practical for the person who's actually going through this right now. Let's say they're dating someone who's hesitant about obligations. What are some things they can actually do to start those conversations, which can be pretty tough to have?
First, think about what you need. What are your non-negotiables? What are you willing to be flexible on? Once you've got that figured out, it's so much easier to talk to your partner.
That makes sense. It's like you can't expect someone else to meet your needs if you don't even know what they are yourself.
Exactly. And when you're ready to actually have that conversation, come at it from a place of vulnerability and curiosity. Instead of blaming or accusing, try sharing your feelings and experiences.
So instead of saying, "Why are you so afraid of commitment?" it's more like, "Hey, I've noticed we haven't really talked about where this is going, and I'm starting to feel a little unsure about what it means for us."
Perfect. You're being honest about your emotions
Yeah.
without putting the other person on the defensive.
Okay, that sounds way less scary. But then what? You have this heart to heart, and then you just wait to see what they say.
Well, remember, communication goes both ways. Listen to what they have to say Ask questions. Try to understand their perspective, even if it's totally different from yours.
Mm.
This is where empathy is so important.
So no matter what, communication is key. Communication? Communication. Did I say it enough?
I think we got it. And don't forget about self-awareness. That's super important. If you find yourself constantly compromising or feeling resentful, it might be a sign that even if this person's great, maybe it's just not the right fit.
That can be such a hard thing to admit, especially when you're really into someone. But you're right. It's better to know sooner rather than later.
Absolutely. It's all part of figuring out what works for you and what doesn't.
So let's put it all together for our listener. Can dating someone who shies away from obligations ever actually be a good thing? Because so far, it sounds like a minefield.
That it doesn't have to be all doom and gloom.
Yeah.
We heard from some listeners who are making it work. And it can be fantastic if both people are on the same page about what they want.
It takes two, right? You need to be on the same page and be willing to work together.
Exactly. And for some people, dating someone who's less traditional, it's exciting. It shakes things up and opens you up to new ways of thinking about relationships.
So the bottom line is there's no one right answer. It depends on the people, the communication, and what they're looking for.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
But before we finish up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listener with something to really think about, because I think this is where things get real. When you're trying to decide if this kind of relationship can actually last.
I'm listening.
Let's say you are dating someone who's not big on obligations. You've talked, you've set boundaries, but you're still feeling a little unsure. What would you actually need to see from your partner to feel like this could really go the distance?
Now that is a great question. It gets you thinking. It's not just about what you say. It's about what would actually show you that your partner's really all in.
Because you know what they say? Actions speak louder than words.
Truth.
Okay, we've given everyone a lot to think about today.
We have, and hopefully our listener feels a little more prepared to approach their dating life with, a little more awareness.
I hope so too.
Yeah.
Until next time, happy dating, everyone.
And may all your relationships have that perfect balance of freedom and commitment.
Okay, so we've been talking about the ups and downs of dating someone who's maybe not so into those traditional relationship obligations, and about how communication and boundaries can really make or break things.
Right. And we've explored how the initial attraction to that kind of dynamic can be super strong, but how things can get complicated when one person wants more.
Totally. But something just occurred to me. We haven't really talked about the role of time.
And time. Interesting. What are you thinking?
Well, like, how long you been dating before these conversations even come up? Does that matter?
It could. But I was thinking more about how our ideas about commitment, they change as we get older. What we're okay with in our 20s might feel totally different in our 30s or 40s.
You're so right. Like, I remember when I was younger, the thought of making plans more than like a week out, it just felt suffocating now. I actually kind of like knowing what's coming.
Exactly. And it's the same with relationships. The more experience we have, the more we figure out what we really want in a partner and how much or how little structure we need to feel secure.
So if you're dating someone who's not big on obligations, it's not just about what you need right now, but also how those needs might change down the line.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
And the same goes for their partner, too. Someone who's hesitant about commitment now might be totally open to it later as they, grow and change.
It's like people always say, you can't fit a square peg in a round hole. Sometimes it's not about changing someone. It's about realizing maybe your timelines, your hopes for the future, they just don't match up.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
And speaking of timelines, do you think there's a right time to have those big conversations about commitment? Like, should you wait a certain number of months or until you've hit some kind of milestone?
That's a good question. What do you think?
I don't think there's a magic formula, but I do think it's important to notice when you're starting to feel like you're on different pages. Those are the times when communication is super important.
Yeah. And sometimes those moments happen pretty early on, right? Like, you realize you have different ideas about exclusivity or how often you want to see each other. And it's clear that those are things you're not willing to budge on.
Exactly. Those early conversations, they can really save you from a lot of heartache later.
Okay. So let's say you've started to notice those differences. You've had some conversations, but you're still not sure what the future holds. What are some signs you can look for to get a better sense of whether this relationship actually has long-term potential, even if your partner isn't the committal type?
I think it can be helpful to shift your focus away from those big romantic gestures and pay more attention to the smaller things. those everyday acts of consideration.
Hmm. Interesting, because those big gestures, they don't always tell the whole story, do they?
Not always. Think about it. Someone could shower you with gifts, but then constantly flake on plans.
Yeah.
Or they could say all the right things about wanting to be with you, but never actually make an effort to include you in their life.
Hmm. Red flags. Actions really do speak louder than words.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So instead of focusing on whether they're saying I love you or planning fancy dates, pay attention to how they show up in those smaller moments.
Like what? Give us some examples. What are some of those everyday actions that could actually signal a deeper commitment? Even if they're not saying, let's move in or let's get married.
Well, one thing to look for is follow through. Do they do what they say they're going to do? If they say they'll call you back, do they? If they make plans, do they stick to them? Or do they always cancel at the last minute?
That's a great point. Being reliable, even in the little things, it shows respect and a willingness to prioritize the relationship, even if it's not in those big traditional ways.
Right. Another thing to think about is how do they handle conflict? Do they shut down, avoid those tough conversations, or are they willing to talk things through and work through disagreements?
Because let's be honest, no relationship is perfect.
Go ahead.
It's all about how you handle the rough patches.
Exactly. If they're always avoiding those difficult conversations, it could be a sign that they're not fully invested in working through those ups and downs that every couple faces.
So good communication and a willingness to work through conflict. Those are good signs. What else?
Pay attention to how much effort they put into getting to know you and whether they want to include you in their life.
Makes sense. If they're serious about building a future with you, they're going to want to share their world with you.
Exactly. Do they introduce you to their friends and family? Do they invite you to things that are important to them? Do they try to learn about your hobbies, your interests?
All great examples. Even if they're not ready to make some big declaration, those actions show that they want you in their life, that they want to build a real connection.
And if they're always keeping you separate, keeping you away from their life, their loved ones, it might mean they don't see you as a long-term partner, no matter what they say.
It's all about whether their actions match their words. So we've talked about follow-through, communication, conflict integration, anything else.
One more thing. Think about how they respond when you share your needs, your requests. Do they try to accommodate you, even if it means stretching a little outside their comfort zone?
So it's not just what they do, it's also about their willingness to meet you halfway.
Exactly. Like, if you've said that date nights are important to you, do they try to make that happen, even if they're not a planner? Or if you need more words of affirmation, more affection, do they try to express themselves more, even if it feels a little awkward for them at first?
I see what you mean. It shows they're not just thinking about themselves, they're really trying to make the relationship work for both of you.
And that's what it's all about, isn't it? Finding that balance where
Yeah.
both people feel seen, heard, respected, even if their needs and desires aren't always perfectly aligned.
Okay, so to recap, we've moved past those big romantic gestures and focused on the smaller, everyday actions that show how strong a relationship really is. We've talked about reliability, communication, conflict integration, and being willing to compromise. But here's what I'm wondering. Is there a point where those smaller actions, they start to add up to something bigger? Like, can they actually lead to a more traditional commitment, even if that wasn't in the picture at first?
That is the million-dollar question. And it's one that I think we should explore in more detail in the next part of our deep dive.
So we've really dug deep into this whole idea of dating someone who's not exactly jumping up and down about commitment. We've talked about the good, the bad, and all the things in between.
We've explored those initial sparks, the potential downsides, and how crucial communication and boundaries are.
Right. And last time, we were starting to think about this question of, can those smaller everyday actions actually lay the groundwork for a more traditional commitment down the road, even if it wasn't on the radar at first?
It makes you think, doesn't it? Because at first glance, it seems kind of backwards. If someone's not really wired for commitment, how could those little gestures ever bridge that gap?
Yeah, it's like, can you really build something lasting, something solid on maybe someday and a few sweet gestures?
Well, here's where things get interesting. Sometimes those smaller actions, they might actually be how someone shows they're committed without feeling like they're trapped or overwhelmed by those traditional expectations.
I see what you mean. It's like they're showing their commitment through what they do, even if they're not ready to say it out loud.
Exactly. And for some people, those actions, they can actually change how they feel about commitment as they experience the relationship, the joy, the security. Those bigger commitments might start to seem less scary, less like they're losing their freedom.
So it's not about forcing someone to change or rushing them into something they're not ready for. It's about creating a space where they can grow at their own pace.
Exactly. And that takes patience and understanding. If you're the one who wants more commitment, you have to respect where they're at and not push.
Makes sense. But I'm thinking there's also a point where you have to check in with yourself.
Right.
Make sure your needs are being met. Because you deserve to be with someone who wants the same things you do, even if they're moving a little slower.
Absolutely. That's why those open, honest conversations are so important. Talking about your needs, listening to theirs.
It's a balancing act for sure. But I imagine there are times when, no matter how hard you try, it becomes clear that you're just on different paths.
That can happen. And it's hard.
Yeah.
Really hard. But sometimes it's the kindest thing you can do for yourself and for them.
Because being in a relationship that's not working, where someone's always sacrificing what they want, it's not good for anyone.
You're right. And even though it hurts to walk away, it can open up the possibility of finding someone who truly gets you, someone who wants the same things.
So, for a listener who's been with us on this journey, what's your best advice for someone who's dating a commitment phobe?
First, trust your gut. If something feels wrong, if you're always second-guessing things, pay attention to that.
Because we usually know deep down what we need, what we deserve, even if it's hard to face.
Exactly. And remember, you're not alone. A lot of people struggle with this, and it's okay to ask for help. Talk to your friends, your family, maybe even a therapist.
It helps to talk things through, to get some perspective.
And lastly, remember that you deserve to be happy. You deserve a relationship that feels good, that feels safe, a relationship where you feel valued and your partner is truly in it with you, whether it looks traditional or not.
Well said. And on that note, we're wrapping up this deep dive into the world of commitment and all its twists and turns.
It's been a pleasure talking about this with you and with our listeners.
Thank you for all your insights. And to our listener, thanks for joining us. We hope you've learned something and that you feel more empowered to create the relationships you want.
Remember, the most important relationship is the one you have with yourself. So be kind to yourself, be patient, and trust that you'll find a love that truly feeds your soul.
Until next time, keep talking, keep setting those boundaries, and keep your hearts open.
See you on the next deep dive.